The action continues here in the first month of the Trump administration, but if you've seen my previous videos, you know I try to cut through the noise and focus on what I think are the real dangers to the republic. In short, so far, the January 6th pardons have created a legal way to get away with political violence, up to and including an attack on our Capitol and lawmakers. The purge of federal employees continues, with an eye toward replacing them with people who are loyal to Trump, personally, not the country, but him. This is especially dangerous with the FBI and Justice Department, which have traditionally been more independent from the president. Trump's White House and Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, continue to unilaterally defund and delete federal programs and agencies, even those duly created by Congress. You know, those folks also elected to represent us and pass laws and stuff. And now, I guess, we need to add a fourth danger in recent days. The notion that Trump and company might outright defy the courts, undermining that other remaining branch of the federal government. All of it adds up to a plan to concentrate vast amounts of power in one man's hands, and even worse, putting us on the path to personalizing that power. Again, concentrated power in the name and service of one man, not the country or we the people. Okay, let's take a step back here on this courts thing. See, the Trump administration has been blocked in a lot of areas by judges. They've put planned cuts and other actions on hold until later appeals and hearings. Remember the early Trump strategy here: flood the zone. Throw so much stuff at opponents, journalists, regular folks that no one can keep up. Speed is essential. Courts slow that down, undermining the strategy. Then, over this past weekend, we had some posts and statements from Trump, Musk, and Vice President J.D. Vance, all questioning the powers of the courts. Musk even went so far as to call for the impeachment of one judge. I have to say, I'm getting a little tired of our unelected billionaire plutocrat shadow president calling so many shots. Anyway, yesterday, in a kind of bizarre press conference in the Oval Office, in which a standing Musk led it while Trump sat by looking on. And Musk's son even seemed to shush him. Look it up. At that press conference, Trump said he does plan to abide by court rulings and will do appeals. He also complained that it does slow down the momentum, which again is part of the strategy. Okay, regardless, all of this has led to what a lot of people are calling a potential constitutional crisis. Boy, there's a phrase almost designed to cause regular people's eyes to glaze over. Let's go into this a bit. First, what is this thing? Constitutional crisis. Well, that's not as clear as it might seem. Definitions can vary. But let's focus on what's happening now and why it might be the way to describe it. Recall that the Constitution sets up three branches with their own responsibilities and powers: the president, the Congress, and the courts. The idea, traditionally, is that power is spread across multiple competing political operators, protecting liberty by splitting up power. The crisis here could be if one of the branches intrudes too far into the domain, the powers of the others. See, the Trumpists are operating under an idea of presidential power called unitary executive theory. Stick with me, no eye glazing. The idea with unitary executive theory is, in its most extreme form, that a president's use of certain kinds of powers can never be questioned or restrained by the other two branches. There is an expansive set of areas that Congress and the courts simply don't have any role in checking and balancing. The idea has been around for a while, by the way. The George W. Bush administration really promoted it, absolutely loved it, especially people like Vice President Dick Cheney. An aside here, Bush a little bit, but Cheney, and especially Cheney's daughter Liz, all became anti-Trumpists in recent years, seeing the potential authoritarian threat. I guess that's welcome, as far as it goes, but also galling, given the damage that administration did to our republic with this theory and the Iraq War. But back to today's story. So, Congress, the courts, they should have no ability to interfere with the president exercising his due authority as the idea goes. The president has absolute power in his domain. Let's recall how this has played out recently with regard to Congress. Trump, Musk, and Doge have basically deleted a couple of entire federal agencies: the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Let's set aside what those do for now and just focus on the fact that these agencies were created and funded by Congress with the bill signed by the president at the time. In other words, their existence is the law of the land. It would take an act of Congress, and the president signing, of course, to truly eliminate them. But Trump and Musk ain't got no time for that. Instead, they simply asserted the authority to shut them down. Similarly, Trump and Musk have tried to unilaterally shut down all kinds of federal spending approved by Congress. Again, just want to do it, so they do. By the way, in order to do so, Doge got access to everyone's private payments info and deets. Totally cool. Sure, some federal government employees have always had access to conduct the nation's business, but apparently that was always tightly controlled. Not now, necessarily. Instead, out of nowhere, a non-Congress created entity, Doge, asserted that it should have free rein. Add to this the ongoing purge of federal employees, including at some nominally independent agencies, using a variety of mechanisms like supposed buyouts. Again, all of these expenditures have been approved by Congress. What to do with this kind of executive overreach into the congressional side of things? I know you'd expect Congress to get upset. But with Republicans in charge of both houses, and with Trump having long ago taken complete and utter control of the party, they're basically sitting this one out. There have been some meek objections here and there. Maybe those will eventually add up to something more like normal politics. But in the meantime, thanks to a bunch of lawsuits, the courts have moved into this breach. Many of Trump's and Musk's actions have been delayed until things can get more clearly sorted out. For a long time, this has been an established part of American public life. Governments, including the federal one, can take actions, but everyone gets their day in court. If you can convince a judge or two that some laws or legal precedents are being broken, you can get a temporary halt. Then everybody gets a chance to put their best legal arguments forward. If it's a big enough deal, it gets to the Supreme Court, who makes the final call. Now back to what I was saying earlier about how Trump, Musk, and Vance all got cranky over the weekend over the court's interference. It's this complaining that got some Trump opponents worried about another potential constitutional crisis, not with Congress this time, but with the courts. The worry is that Trump will simply ignore court rulings, that he'll just say, nah, I don't like that ruling, so I'll just ignore it and do what I want. As a nation, we then have to ask, what then? What happens when a president brazenly ignores the checks and balances of one of the other three branches of government? Who wins? Who loses? Who's in charge? Put most bluntly, who, in the end, gets to wield power? See? Crisis. For what it's worth, Trump said yesterday at the Oval Office press conference with Musk that he's open to filing legal appeals and so on. That could be a sign that we could return to a kind of normal order. But today, the Trump administration, through its spokesperson, pushed back hard, arguing that the courts were the ones, in fact, precipitating the crisis. The mere act, it seems, of hearing cases and issuing court orders was, by definition, interference with the presidency. Remember, under unitary executive theory, they're the supreme boss. No one can check them in their zone. The courts can try, but crisis. We even have a handy example of the Trump administration asserting its authority against both Congress and the Supreme Court with TikTok. See, Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, passed a law, again signed by the then president, to force a sale of TikTok to non-Chinese investors, or it had to shut down. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court determined that the law was legit. It was already supposed to go into effect. But Trump decided, no, I like TikTok now. He says it helped him win the youth vote. So he's decided to delay the process, ignoring the duly constituted law. Crisis. It's important to note that we as a country have been in this kind of place before, where it was unclear who really had authority in a given space. There's a famous example from during the time of the Andrew Jackson administration that often comes up. This is from 1832, mind you. That was just around a couple of decades after the Constitution took effect. The Supreme Court made a ruling in a case. The details of it don't matter right now. But there's a famous quote that's associated with it. Quote, John Marshall, then the Chief Justice, has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Supposedly Jackson said this, but the evidence isn't really good for that. Anyway, the point is, what are the courts to do if a president tells them to screw off? Eventually, everyone stepped back from the ledge on that one. We might not be so lucky this time. What then? In other words, a lot of this comes down to how hard Trump and his supporters want to push this idea of a uniquely powerful president, supreme in his areas, with the other two branches having no say. Suppose Congress doesn't reassert control over its power to set federal spending. Do they just become budget advisors only, leaving all the real decisions to the president? Suppose the courts get defied. Do they lose all power to interpret the law when it comes to whatever the president says it is? We might see that most plainly in Trump's trying to end birthright citizenship, the idea that if you're born on U.S. soil, you're in the club. Now, some constraints on this might be a good idea, honestly, but that's not the point. Do we want to leave such significant and plainly constitutional rights up to whatever president is in power on whims? Where do we go from here? Now look, some of the authority that Trump is asserting might end up being legit. Maybe once the dust has settled, we'll find that Congress did, in fact, give presidents discretion in some areas, like spending. But let's take the time and sort it out. Remember that flooding the zone and speed are key to the strategy to assert power. If the power is legit, then it should be able to survive the test of scrutiny. Thoughtful, deliberate scrutiny. You know, democracy. I've said before, the simplest cut in politics is to ask, what if the other side did this? Would I consider the action wrong if the other tribe did it? If so, why should my tribe do it? I'd imagine that Republicans would be up in arms if a Democrat tried to assert this kind of authority and pried into private data like Doge has. Does anyone really want our system to become something like electing a king every 4 years? I feel like we answered that one back in the Revolution. Let's use that as a basis for unwinding the crisis. And for crying out loud, get back to something like politics as normal. Good luck, America.